These microphones are dangerous. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you all for joining us for the continuing collaboration between the Metropolitan Opera and the Guggenheim. It's our first appearance of the season in the Works and Process series. I'm playing hooky tonight from the performance of Norma, which has just started on the stage of the Met, where primitive druid rites are commanding our stage at this very moment. Of course, that's a far cry from the plot of The Exterminating Angel, which is set at an elegant dinner party in Spain in the 1960s after a night at the opera. But in this surreal dinner party, the guests are tested to their limit, and upper-class manners soon turn primitive too. You might say that the storyline of Exterminating Angel, in which the characters are trapped in an inexplicable, nightmarish scenario from which they can't seem to ever escape, rings particularly true today. So much for art imitating our daily political life. But we're here to talk about the thrilling catharsis of opera, not the meanness of politics. And with me on stage are the prodigious creators of The Exterminating Angel, the composer Thomas Adès, and the librettist and stage director Tom Cairns. For those of you who don't know it, The Exterminating Angel receives its North American premiere at the Met on October 26th, which is right around the corner for all of us sitting up here. Tom Adès, of course, is one of our most gifted composers, whose first opera, Powder Her Face, based on a true-life British sex scandal, created a sensation when it was premiered when he was all of 24 years old. His second opera, which was an adaptation of Shakespeare's The Tempest, there's an image from our Met production, was enthusiastically received at its premiere at the Met in 2012. His operas have appeared on the leading stages, including, in the case of The Exterminating Angel, the Salzburg Festival, and the Royal Opera House. And his symphonic and chamber works have been performed by the world's foremost orchestras and chamber ensembles. He's also an excellent conductor who will be leading the performances of The Exterminating Angel at the Met, as he did in the case of The Tempest when he made his Metropolitan Opera conducting debut back in 2012. So please, again, welcome Tom Adès. Tom Cairns, his namesake, is a gifted director of theater, film, and opera, as well as being a very talented librettist. His staged works have appeared throughout the world. He first collaborated with Tom Adès on The Tempest, staging the original production as world premiere at Covent Garden in 2004. They obviously hit it off, since with The Exterminating Angel, Tom is working in the dual capacity of not only stage director, but also co-librettist. This will be his, Tom Cairns, Metropolitan Opera debut. Please welcome Tom Cairns. So, the Tom Adès' operatic adaptation of Luis Buñuel's now classic film depicts a dinner party that might seem to have arisen in hell. Here are some images from earlier performances in Salzburg and London, which will give you an idea of some of the staging that we have not yet seen on the stage of the Met, because it's only tomorrow that we actually have our first stage and orchestra rehearsals. We've been putting it together in pieces. So tomorrow is when we're adding costumes to our rehearsals, and from this day forth, we'll be able to show you photographs of the Met staging. But many members of the cast in the production at the Met have performed this opera in the original presentations in Salzburg and London. So some of the people you're seeing in these images are in the Met production as well. And the story, just to give you a very quick synopsis, is after a performance of Donizetti's Lucia de Lammermoor, an upper crust group is invited to the mansion of Lucia and Edmondo di Nobile for a post-opera supper. Meanwhile, as the guests are arriving, the servants are inexplicably fleeing. The guests soon discover that they are psychologically and physically incapable of leaving. Eventually, they run out of food and water and descend into depths of chaos and various other states of depravity. That's the story. So, you'll hear some elaborations on that. I should start with you, Tom Adès. So from sex scandal to Shakespeare to a surrealist dinner party, no one can accuse you of having a one-track mind when it comes to choosing your subjects of operas. What attracted you to the Buñuel film in the first place?
Well, there was no other possible subject for me. It just had to be. I had to do it. I mean, at the time, to me, it felt like almost offspring of my first opera and my second opera, in the sense that it's quite similar to The Tempest plot if you abstract it a little, in that they are shipwrecked, if you like. They're abandoned, marooned, although there is no storm and there is no island and there's no magician, but there's this invisible force. So many of the same things happen. And then, of course, it's also about, I suppose, a fairly refined society that becomes less and less refined, that degrades as the thing goes on, which is also a bit similar to my first opera. So in some ways, it is rather kind of my territory, actually, in some ways, than before.
When was your first encounter with the Buñuel film?
Oh, I would have been in my very early teens, if that. I mean, the BBC screened a big season of Buñuel films, and my mother, being a historian of art and surrealism in particular, this was the sort of normal thing for me to watch when I was 13. But to me, I know it seems, but to me it just seemed normal. And I watched. Most of them I remember quite clearly seeing these films, Phantom of Liberty and The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, and this one. Actually, this one probably would have, I imagine, puzzled me a bit more. I mean, it's in black and white, and it's a rather sober film a lot of the way through, whereas the others are very funny, actually. But
there is humor in the film.
Oh yes. No, I just mean to a 13-year-old, I would have. You know, the humor is very dry. It's very, very dry, and the opera, I think I would say, it's much amplified, the humor and the slapstick and various other aspects are probably more colourful literally in the opera than they are in the film, in a way. It's rather underplayed, the film. But you know, the Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie and Phantom of Liberty are almost like Monty Python in places, whereas this one it's more of a dry joke. But the idea of it just stayed with me, and actually I think we wanted to do this before The Tempest, if I remember rightly.
That was the original plan.
So this is going right back into the 20th century.
So Tom Cairns, you also knew this film from an early time on, or when did you become familiar with it?
I did, but like many things in life, it had sort of drifted somewhere, and when it was mentioned, I slowly put it together in my brain, and then obviously I watched it, and it all came back. So I did know it, yeah. I went to art school originally, so it was de rigueur to watch Buñuel, Fellini, you know, Pasolini, the whole list of great auteurs.
How did the two of you meet?
I banged his door down because I wanted him to direct The Tempest, and we'd never met, and he thought, who is this person? But I talked you into it, I think. I bullied you. No? Is that right?
Well, it wasn't quite like that.
but I think that was how it happened.
You Tom invited me to join him, as it were. And I'd sort of, I work across a few genres, theatre and a bit of film and TV and opera, and I'd sort of, at that point, sort of thought maybe of all of those things, I had done enough opera. Not that I'd done that much, but I thought maybe that was enough. And Tom started it all up again.
So you decided you talked to each other about The Tempest, but at the same time you were thinking about this project even then.
I think there were copyright problems
Yes.
with the film, and
Yeah.
then
We shouldn't go into those.
we won't go into that. Well, in fact, it was rather like the film in that there actually weren't copyright problems, but there was actually no reason. I won't go into it, but I mean, as it turned out, years later, I could have just gone ahead. Having
Shakespeare is less
Shakespeare, of
demanding
course,
when it comes to
and
copyright.
by this point, there was this firm date in the Covent Garden Diary, and I thought, I've really got to. And The Tempest just sort of jumped in there ahead, got in there ahead, and then that was 2004, and now here we are.
Yeah, exactly.
However many years later.
So, but this film, for those of you who haven't seen the film, it's an incredibly complicated ensemble collection of dinner guests. And in fact, in the opera, you've simplified it slightly by eliminating a few of the characters. I think in the film there must be more than 20.
Yes.
Whereas in the opera there are 15 principal characters, I believe.
Yes.
Which in itself is probably the largest collection of principals in any opera that I know of. So how do you, I mean, that's an incredible challenge you set out for yourselves, both of you, in terms of being able to create a new opera and a theatrical context for it with so many different characters that you have to keep in play.
Well, we whittled it down. We actually combined some of the other characters, but to actually the smallest number that you could have to make the thing function, the conversations and the arguments and the different archetypes. The people, two people had to have children. There was a married couple. There were things like this. But then, for me, it was very enjoyable to have this kind of merry-go-round of the different characters with each other. Of course, tricky to stage because in the film you can simply cut away from a character who's not involved in a scene, but in the opera they're going to be there all the time. So Tom came up with this brilliant solution of the revolve, which I don't know.
Yeah. There's a whole problem, obviously, because you're watching an opera in wide shot the whole time. So it's with that many people on stage. If you've got a soprano singing an aria, you know where to look, you know where the focus is for you to pay attention and to be involved. But to be honest, we didn't think of this, or I didn't, when we were coming up with what to do. And when I think back now, I think how naive I certainly was about it, because we never once said, we used to think there's a lot of people in this, but we never once said, but how's this actually going to work as an opera? How are you going to have all these people on stage that never leave the stage for the whole evening? That's a pretty unique thing for anything, let alone an opera. And I'll tell you stories later about the curtain call and how do you do the curtain call when there's no lead singer. It's an ensemble of thoroughbreds, of great singers, all having equal weight on stage. So I do think back, Tom, and I think when we sat in that room for 10 days working out the first draft of how we might approach this thing, I certainly was quite naive and didn't quite realize the scale of the task in terms of those things I've talked about, like focus and how do you manage that many people and how do you find the focus for them.
Maybe you could explain, since Tom Adès, you already started doing that, who are the various characters? So just to...
Their names, you mean?
What their names, I know you know their names. The different types of people who are in this party.
Oh yes. Well,
this is a dinner party after the opera.
We'll do them together because
to.
one could forget. There's a young, beautiful couple who you'll hear later actually singing. Right. Who should I say what happens to them?
Well,
why don't we save that for?
Yeah, I won't give the game away, but they a certain thing happens to them. That was embarrassing, sorry. There's a rather wonderful doctor figure who tries for most of the evening to take control of things and be rational and be very straightforward about how this might be solved. And of course, he's up against a force greater than him. There's the host and hostess who are rather wonderful. And actually, for the whole evening, the hostess had planned a rather eccentric evening. It wasn't just a dinner. She wanted to be sort of to use that overused word, surrealist in nature, and she has brought sheep into the house and a bear, and she, at the beginning, I don't think it's too much to give this away, when the food arrives, she has arranged that the servant who carries the food will drop it, and it crashes and goes everywhere, and she has all these wonderful plans for the evening, so she's very interesting.
And there are 3 live sheep in the show.
Yes, the opera opens with the sheep being delivered to the house, to these wonderful bells. Who else, Tom? Who
Well,
else
these
could we
things are, so they are aristocrats who are hosting this reception after the opera that they've all just been to see. So you have the star of the opera, Laetitia, who is a professional soprano who's just sung her Lucia. You have the conductor of that performance that they've all just seen, Senor Rock, and his wife, Bianca, who is a concert pianist who plays later in the, you'll hear, a piece composed by someone called Paradisi. And
your alter ego.
My alter ego. That's who I am in the world of the opera. My name in Spanish actually means Hades. So Paradisi and Hades, we both. So we both appear. And then you have an explorer called Raoul who lives in the United States and is a bit of a sort of cad, and he's rather fast and he's brilliant high tenor, Freddie Antoun. You have the youngest colonel in the army.
This man here, you see on screen on the right side. And he's having an affair with the hostess, the lady behind him.
They're all very, and you have Leonora, who's an older a woman who's ill, and she's actually under the care of the doctor, who, as the thing goes on, I find him rather poignant because there is, logic to what's happening to them, but he starts to say things like, "I must organize a cleaning rota." The point is, the door is absolutely wide open. They could all just walk through it, rather than be there weeks later saying, "I'm going to organize a cleaning rota." None of it is logical. But in the film, these are, to me, absolutely three-dimensional characters. I can picture their homes and exactly what their life. Or there's also 2 very important I've left out. The Duchess of Avila, Sylvia, who is going to, you'll see, sing Sally Matthews, who's very, very elegant. She's actually a young widow who goes to the party with her brother, and it's all slightly off color. There's an unhealthy relationship in some form between the 2 of them. He's very fastidious and a bit effeminate and keeps taking these little pills and things.
That's because he's got, as he says, my ulcerations. He's got
but
stomach
he's
issues.
probably addicted to it. Anyway, he's a sort of complicated, difficult character, and he obviously has a terrible time in the house as the weeks wear on.
So it's quite a menagerie of.
It's a menagerie, but what excited me actually is that it's not just about 1 or 2 characters and their story. It's a collective experience of very real people, and you start to realise that what it's about is all of them, and then, if I dare say, all of us, as it widens, it changes at the end. So it's rather, Buñuel plays a game on two levels. You do get drawn into what they're doing, but the whole point is that there's something completely outside them, which is a separate part of the story. Perhaps personified in the music by...
Well, we should hear some music. So, having said that, the first piece that we're going to hear is called "Variations for Bianca," which is the work of the fictional composer Paradisi, and it appears early on in the action before things start to deteriorate.
Yes, the situation is that everyone's had dinner. It's gone a little bit wrong because that crashing of the food didn't go down well at all with the rest of the guests. So Lucia and her husband Nobile are a little bit anxious, but they all go through from the dining room into the salon. The next part of the evening will be this piano solo, which they all dutifully listen to, and then the action develops out of this eventually.
And things go downhill from there.
They certainly do.
So please Sorry, Tom, do you want to say something else?
In the opera, you hear various conversations during this music, but it's also a concert piece.
Right. So please welcome Met assistant conductor and pianist Dimitri Dover, who will be playing variations for Bianca. beautiful. I noticed on the score, Dimitri was coming to the end, the letters written "close piano" at the end.
I'm not sure what that means.
That's not. That's not in the staging.
I don't
No, it
remember
might
that.
be for the next
That happens
person
later on.
performing or
Yes,
something.
yes, it could be something.
Oh,
like
that's
that.
right.
I'm
Or
not
something
sure.
like that.
Interesting.
Though we have directions like that, I must admit.
Oh yes,
So
it's
tell us about some of the extraordinary instruments that you have included. I mean, piano is obviously on the more conventional side of things, but you have some very unusual instruments from the Ondes Martenot to miniature, tiny little violins, all kinds of tricks and things.
Well, yes, it's basically a regular orchestra, but with several, I suppose, extensions. I mean, by far the most glamorous and I suppose aristocratic in my mind is the Ondes Martenot, an extremely special, rare and wonderful instrument in many ways.
Can you describe what that does?
I'm going to get this wrong, but well, it's an electronic sound. It's one of the earliest electronic instruments, indeed, it's developed, I believe. And it has a very wide range, wider really than the piano even. You can play it two ways, either on a keyboard or on a sort of thread, which one can run one's finger along on a ring, which of course means that you can create a continuous glissando. And it's has many different voices and different colors, from very intensely human and expressive or violin-like to things that are perhaps otherworldly, or even, I like to say, in a way, supernatural, because in some ways an electronic sound, although it is natural, but in some ways it has the same relation. If you think of the orchestra as a human world, as a human universe, as I do rather, I mean, the oboes mean one thing to us and the clarinets, then an electronic instrument is like a superhuman or supernatural. I mean, it's probably a strange way of thinking, but that's how it feels to me. And so this comes to almost stand for the voice or the mind of the exterminating angel, which, of course, the whole point is there is no exterminating angel, but whatever it is making them stay in the house.
So there's something that's preventing them from leaving.
Whatever that thing is, you can hear. It's almost as though you can hear it in the Ondes Martenot, for example. Early in the piece, if they should just be going home, but they say something like, "Oh, I think I might just stay another 5 minutes and have another cup of coffee," you might hear this sound in the background as if to say, "This was me." And of course, there's also one other thing. There's a guitar solo, a number in the film, one of his great dream sequences, I think, a sort of surrealist dream sequence. We've used a Buñuel poem, actually, from another source, and have it accompanied with a guitar solo, which is it's very, and actually combined with the Ondes Martenot, which I think probably is the first time those two things have met. Rather like the sewing machine and the iron or whatever it was that Duchamp combines as a classic surrealist image.
It has been used, I know, by Messiaen in some of his pieces.
Archetypally, by far the greatest writing, I think, for me, for Ondes Martenot. But he uses it in as a ecstatic way, of a religious or for love music, and incredibly effectively. I've sort of, in my mind, reclaiming it for spookiness and as well as that, and otherworldliness.
It has a sort of theremin-like quality.
It's a close relation, I suppose, right. Even a son or daughter of the theremin, I suppose.
And what about these tiny little miniature violins that the orchestra plays in the first half?
Well, a friend who had a young child, very small child, had this 32nd size violin, this minute thing, and I picked it up and started to play it, and it really... It feels as though there are tiny people in the skirting board it's the most sort of startling sound. You have to use the tiny bow as well. It's no use using a normal tiny. So at one point, it's the point where somehow things have really got, reality has emphatically left them behind, right towards the end of Act 3, just before one of the final exterior scenes. And I think 16 or however many people in the violins pick up these tiny things, and I won't give it away.
How do they do?
They're playing fantastic. Once they got used to the idea, I think they were enjoying it. Yes.
Okay, excellent. And what is the lion's roar?
Oh, that's an old percussion instrument. It's a sort of waxed bit of string, a rope that you pull. It makes a rude sort of roaring sound. I think probably I use it when the bear roars. Yes. Yes. And there's a door which slams in the percussion, which is just a door.
Yes, yes. Well, it's always good to have one. The
Best.
so when you started working on this piece, and this is really for both of you, I know traditionally the libretto is written first and then the music is written afterwards. I mean, normally that's the way it happens. How does that work in terms of your relationship as collaborators?
How did we do this?
Yeah.
Well, it started with, as I think I said, Tom and I sitting in a room for 10 days, trying to find some sort of shape to it and trying to work out how to condense it in some way so that an opera could be written from the movie, basically. And once we'd done that and kind of, I literally wrote, I can't tell you how much down about our conversations. And then I went back to, you were in Los Angeles then, weren't you? And I went back to
2009.
London and did the first of the very first drafts just to get something on paper. And I think at that point, well, I know at that point, I don't know if I should say it, we were thinking of a slightly more condensed piece with no interval and this and that. There were all
Yes.
sorts of
Yes.
things we talked about. And so that first draft was essentially what we ended up doing, but it was tighter in terms of the amount of information we were giving out. And then Tom rightly thought it needed to be expanded from that. Yes. And then the process continued many, many drafts later, yes, with Tom contributing a great deal back into the thing itself. And I think that's how it worked out, isn't it?
Do you start composing though until the libretto was absolutely locked?
No, I would say I started composing at about the 6th draft of a libretto.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
it was almost as though it was watching something that was a certain size, then having to eat a lot and swallow a lot, and it expanded like that, and then it sort of suddenly went back like this, but it had absorbed these things and acquired itself an interval.
Yes, it did. And we were then delighted because
Yes.
we could suddenly jump forward a
Yes,
number of
3
weeks,
weeks, and
without defining how far
yeah.
we'd gone. But after the interval, you see a very different image to the one you've got used to, because quite a lot of time has passed. So we were able to actually use a film technique and just do a great big cut in terms of time. You're right. So it sort of was like that, then it was like that,
Yes.
and then it was like that.
And the music did that as well. I mean, there was probably a 6-hour opera, the first draft that I did, and then I looked at it, I think this is 6 hours long. So a lot of things. And there were also to have moments in the opera, like we might see actually, where there are moments of like an aria or duet, which you need a certain kind of words. It's not that useful to have just dry dialogue for a moment like that. So I borrowed a couple of Buñuel poems and also 2 other sources, poems from, one is by Bialik, Hebrew poet, Over the Sea, and the other one is a big piece from the 1100s, Yehuda ben Halevi, Zion, do you ask of my piece? It's a very famous poem, and those are in it as well. So just to kind of, it's somehow the moment when someone has to stand and just give if you like, a more vertical kind of time rather than horizontal time of people saying dialogue. So, and that's the libretto.
And when, I know that, I know you and I have talked about this in the past about the Tempest. Where did you start composing? I mean, which part of the libretto did you tackle? Did you start from the beginning?
I actually think I started with that piano piece.
You did.
And because it has that's the variations is on actually an old Ladino song, La Vaba La Blanca Nina. Blanca's the character who plays it. I wrote, and I suppose I must have then put some dialogue on top of that. Hard to remember, but I didn't start at the beginning. It doesn't really almost have a beginning. Well, this piece does have a beginning. I knew it would start with bells, but it took me a very long time to figure out exactly what the bells would play.
And I remember you saying to me, Tom, several times, way early on, that you would literally maybe this is not quite right, but it was something like this, because we've been doing this for 8 years. Something about post-its, or you'd have a fragment of a phrase and you'd just write it down and stick it on a wall.
Literally.
And one of those things where
Yes.
you slowly
Yes.
pull all those things into the
Yes.
bigger picture.
It looked like the end of that film, A Beautiful Mind, where he's sort of covered, the walls covered with map. But and that's literally, I stuck them things to the wall, and some things would stay there for literally years. And then suddenly I'd look up and the moment would come. It'd be, you're on, come now. And some of them, I'm afraid, the opera finished and they turned yellow and they had to go in the bin.
It's funny you mentioned A Beautiful Mind. I'm curious, when you're composing, are you seeing the music, the notes, as well as hearing them in your mind?
I think it's like an imaginary building that exists in your mind, but then you have to make it a real building, I suppose. I hear them more than see. I hear the characters more than see them, which is very, very, very exciting for me to see them in costume and actually doing things and walking up and down the stage. That's an always extraordinary moment. It's like the reality.
But what can you talk a little bit more about what actually is the creative process for you in terms of how do you compose?
Every time it was different, and this opera was the first time, as I say, I wrote a huge, very sprawling draft, just to somehow be able to feel that this story does have an underlying musical river in it that kind of flows all the way through, but I had to know that it was there before I could really, because you could run into an obstacle and think, oh, there's no music here. This is, and then I actually started again at the beginning, and almost 70% of that, I suppose it got, I say thrown away, it's more that it got, that was like a big block of, marble or whatever, and I chipped away, and I did keep the bit in the middle, not the other stuff.
Are you thinking about the orchestration as you were composing at all times?
Yes, in a way, particularly something like the Old Martineau, because it was almost a character in its own right, and I say almost, it is a character. I'd write, this is on the line.
And how has the piece evolved? We're the third opera house we're a co-commissioner, of course, which we're very proud of, but we're the third in line. It was performed first in Salzburg, as I mentioned earlier, and then in London. How have you been tinkering with the piece, both of you, in terms of from the original staging to the time it now arrives at the Met?
Well, you don't often get the chance with a new piece to do it again and again and again in opera houses at this level, and generally even. So that's been rather wonderful. I would say essentially the piece is the same as it's always been, but it's certainly been clarified by the time we got to England. It's been expanded because the house in Salzburg was a little bit smaller. Now we've come to the Metropolitan Opera. I mean, I could go into a million details, but broadly speaking, for instance, I think we'll know tomorrow if we're going to do this, we've customized some of the opening and closing ideas for the Met itself using some of the chandeliers in the Metropolitan Opera. And there've been all sorts of responses. We've made all sorts of responses to the place we were in the situation. But mainly what has been thrilling for me, and I'm sure you as well, Tom, is when the singers, who were understandably quite,
Stressed.
They were stressed by seeing this music and the scale of the piece and the amount of time we had to do it and all of that. Seeing them not only do it for the first time wonderfully, but in the way they have grown as an ensemble. It's to someone like us who's been watching that process, it's been thrilling really at the confidence of how they're like a kind of acting company who've been around for 30 years or something. It's thrilling really.
Things like the opening, when they first walk on stage, it's a 15-part vocal ensemble, actually very complex, where they all just say enchanted in each other's names, and it really is a piece of martial art to get them all to come in at the right moment and sing the line, and it should all sort of become this effortless tapestry. And I mean, it took a week for us to put that anywhere near the stage the first time.
It really.
And now they come in,
They do
exactly what they.
Because I had written Enchanted. I'm senior so and so Enchanted. And they all said hello to each other, and then Tom wrote this thing that was. I mean, you'll hear it, I hope, but it's a very wonderfully complex response to people just saying hello to each other. It's sort of
they're enchanted, they're under a spell. And the one thing I did add, which is the first, I'm very excited to hear it, is that at the end of the piece, as this whole, the thing starts to, the process happens again. I mean, without giving it too much away, and then the way to kind of make clear what was happening, there's a moment in Act 1 where you suddenly, out of the blue, hear these drums, very repetitive drumming, which I took from a real-life festival in Spain, massed drums, and everybody of the village drums the same rhythm for the whole day. I think it's an Easter ritual. And it was Buñuel's town, where he came from, Calanda. And I suddenly realized that the drums had to come back at the very, very, very end, just to sort of, we haven't had that before, so I've put them in. So we'll hear that for the first time this week. I'm very excited. Yes.
That's of course, we're very happy to be third in line, so that you have a chance to use things and develop things and add things to the work. Before we hear the next musical selection, I thought, Tom Cairns, you might talk a little bit more about the physical production, because there's a very impressive arch that's part of the production, and you worked very closely with Hildegard Beckler, who's the designer of the scenery and the costumes, and there's projection, there's interesting lighting. Can you talk a little bit about the physical production?
Absolutely.
You mentioned the turntable, of course.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief, but we were in a unique situation in many ways. One of them was that at least I knew what the libretto was going to be and what the piece should be, but of course we didn't have any music, and in a situation like that you have to work, a situation like opera and bigger productions, you have to have conceived the piece and come up with a concept way ahead of the time it will be performed. In this case, it was about 2 years before we were doing our first performance, the whole concept of the piece and all the ideas, the visual ideas had to be in place. We were well aware of one thing, which is a thing I mentioned earlier about this thing about how to focus things for the audience. In other words, where should they look at what point? I mean, if you imagine how big the Met stage is, how wonderfully wide and huge and commanding it is, we needed to, for these large theatres, work on something visually that could help people know that. So we came up with two things at once. Hildegard Beckler's style, if you like, mostly, is to sort of base her work on a sort of realism, but at the same time quite simplified. So she takes elements of reality, but she simplifies them down into, in this case, obviously there's a space into another room. So if you're in the dining room and you go into the salon, you sit down and listen to the piano, you've got to go back through the dining room and out through the house to leave. And around most doors, there's an architrave, as we call it in England. I hope it's the same word. In other words, the moulding around a door, and that's what defines that space, with or without doors. And so that became the central element of the set design, which is very, very large. I don't think it's in any of the pictures, actually. Wooden, it's almost like an arch that's been inspired from the moulding around a door. So in other words, there's a sort of sense of reality with this thing. It's in this beautiful dark wood as well. So you feel you know what you're looking at, but actually you're not looking at a real thing. You're looking at something that's been developed out of something that was real, this architraving. And then there are various other walls, one which can project behind it beautiful curtains blowing in the wind, or something rather frightening out through the window. and so that there are elements of architecture that when they're all combined will make you feel like you're really in a room, but can somehow float away, literally, and make the room seem a much more frightening thing. And to just wrap up on this, we do exactly that. So this arch that would normally have a fixed position in a room has the capability of moving on its own very slowly and rather frighteningly into all sorts of positions. And the way we stage the opera is that as long as we're on this side of that arch, wherever it is on the stage, the story is still being told, that they can't go through it. So it sort of heightens the sense of going into another room. It makes it an even more ominous situation because of this piece of architecture. And the only other thing we do is we have a turntable, a slow revolve, that can work, that can counter the movements of this arch. And what both those things do together, I hope, is that they bring a small scene into focus. So they're moving all the time, though the audience aren't aware of it. Sometimes they are, but mostly they aren't. So they're moving at an incredibly slow speed, and while one scene is happening, another one is on its way around to you, so that it's not happening way up at the back there, or you're not knowing where to look. The moment someone sings, you think, of course, that's where they should be, I can see them. So it's a very sophisticated piece of machinery, this arch thing, as is a turntable. And so Hildegard and I worked through the opera for literally years to work out how we'd make the piece move and flow and stay in focus for everyone.
And there are lots of other production elements, including real fire, some plumbing, water.
Absolutely.
A disembodied, mysterious hand that creeps across the set.
That's right. There's a section where they start to hallucinate and all sorts of things happen. I won't go into all of that, but and then things like those sheep that were delivered at the beginning of the piece when Lucia imagined she was going to have an entertainment using live sheep, which was promptly cancelled, obviously. They do make an appearance later in the opera, and in fact, I think I can say, they managed to get hold of them and get them into the room, and they cut them up and eat them. They build a fire.
Using a cello.
And they chop up wood and furniture, and they cook the sheep and eat them. But before
we don't actually do that to the real sheep.
Yes, we do. And before that, they need water as well. So of course they start to dig into the pipes of the house to try and get water. So literally, they're doing that at one point, and there's a water jet right up in the air that they all grab water from. So it becomes quite pagan almost, how they react to these basic things that we all need.
So now we're going to hear some more music. There's a great romantic line in the opera, which are this pair of young lovers, Beatrice and Eduardo, sorry.
Eduardo, yeah.
Thinking of the cigar. Eduardo. And they have two duets, one in Act 1 and one in Act 3, and they are recently engaged. They're madly in love, and they're also doomed. But we'll hear their two duets. Is that you want to add something to that? Or?
No,
All right. So, please welcome our two young artists, soprano Sophie Bevan and tenor David Portillo, once again accompanied by Dimitri Dover, who will be singing the two duets from The Exterminating Angel.
That was extraordinary. Right?
So we actually have one more musical performance to offer you, which is the Act 3 aria Berceuse Macabre, which is sung by the soprano Sally Matthews, who plays the role of Sylvia, who at the point in the opera where when she sings this is completely unhinged and towards the end of the opera, and is singing this song while rocking what she thinks is her son in her arms, which is actually a dead sheep.
I'm afraid so, yes. But in the opera, she hears his voice. Good night, Mama, at the end. In fact, in the film, this happens
because
as well.
her boy is outside trying to
Yes.
get in through this invisible force field, but is unable to do so.
That's right.
So now, please welcome Sally Matthews, accompanied by Dmitri Dover. So, of course, you haven't heard Tom Adès' score until you hear it fully orchestrated at the Met, and that's what we hope you will be joining us for when our opera opens on the 26th and subsequent performances. Before we wrap up, I think it might be interesting just to talk a little bit about what we're sort of in the final countdown stage for the opera. It's been rehearsing for more than 4 weeks now. It's on stage. It's been on stage with piano up until through today. Tomorrow, it finally everything comes together, as I think we mentioned earlier, with orchestra and all instrumentation, full forces, all forces blazing away. What will you, both of you, what are you going to be looking for now in the final week as we approach the opening?
I'm looking forward to doing the final knitting together of everything. I should say the forces, as we talk about, of the Metropolitan Opera are with us on this, and it's sort of colossal, the amount of work that has to be done to make something as simple as this, as the aria you've just heard, work simply and effectively on stage. But I cannot tell you the amount of work people are doing at this very moment, because we're kind of peaking on both staging and technical issues, which is a sort of boring word, but it's all of that that makes the piece flow and seem as if it just happened, as if we almost did nothing to make it happen, and that's really where we are at the moment. And from here on, it'll be great to finally pull every element together, not least the orchestra.
I mean, it's actually very close to what I'm thinking as well, that it was something, as you've heard, so difficult, you know, to sing, difficult to play, it's complicated and all that. But that is not important, actually. That's not the point for everyone else. The point is that we overcome these difficulties, and actually it speaks directly and, in a way, realistically. So I'm going to be working with the singers and orchestra, you know, make sure the balance is clear, that we, wherever possible, you know, I suppose the point of the line comes across emotionally, rather than just it's only a beautiful sound. It is that, but it's also got to be clear. So that's something I'm a bit obsessed with these days. So we'll be working on that.
You know, and also in such a complicated work, we all know that even with all the rehearsals of the separate elements, when you put it all together, everything changes.
Yes.
Singers who have felt confident with singing on stage with a piano suddenly freak out with the orchestra, and,
Yes.
and you have to sort of bring them all together.
Yes, and you know, sometimes the first time through, you know, the balance might not be quite right, and everyone has to understand how, and then when we get it right, there's an alchemy that happens, that's what opera, you know, is this mysterious alchemy.
Right. Well, thank you both so much, and our performers were wonderful, since they have been rehearsing all day, and they have to rehearse all day tomorrow, and so do you. So I hope that you all have had a chance to get a taste of what this wonderful opera is going to be like, and thank you so much.